Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Edge Hill University. My name is Chris Jones. I'm one of the volunteer chaplains here at the university. I've had a connection with Edge Hill for 13 years, since I became vicar of Ormskirk Parish Church, and I was delighted when I was invited by the university to be one of the volunteer chaplains. I was also involved in the chaplaincy launch a year ago. At the moment we have a team consisting of Rabbi Shmuley Brown, myself, Reverend Melvin Kelly from Emmanuel Methodist and URC Church, Reverend Stuart Haynes and Mrs. Kirsty Childs. We do hope to expand the team and people at the uni are working on doing that at the moment. We've been given a very comfortable base as a chaplaincy in the old Students' Union office in the street, very conveniently just opposite the bar. And also within easy reach of the, I think, magnificent Hub building. So a very good place to be. So please come and see us. Our email's in this brochure that was sent out with the bookings, or you can get the email from the website or from outside our offices. Now, our speaker tonight, Bishop James, has always been supportive of our efforts to get the chaplaincy up and running here, and I thank him for that. And he accepted our invitation to come and speak this evening. I think in many ways the timing could not have been more appropriate, being so near to the anniversary of the tragic events of Hillsborough in April 1989. Who could forget that dreadful day? Nor should it be forgotten. And the ripples from such events as this show the need, I think, for pastoral support which chaplaincies can bring. So there's an extra little plug for the chaplaincy. I have to say that when we heard that Bishop James had been invited to chair the Hillsborough Independent Panel, some of us in the diocese were a bit nervous that he'd been handed a poisoned chalice, opening himself up to the likelihood of fierce criticism from whoever did not like the panel's conclusions. However, I and many others have been most impressed by his and the panel's and of course the family's courage, integrity and tenacity in pursuing justice as seen in the report. In this and in other tasks which he has undertaken in his 15 years as Bishop of Liverpool, Bishop James has shown great wisdom and perception, as well as being supportive of the church people in the Diocese of Liverpool and also the communities of Liverpool in general. You can read more about that in this little leaflet here as well. It's a great encouragement to me in my work to see how the church still has a key role in our wider society. So it therefore gives me great pleasure to introduce you to the Right Reverend James Jones, Bishop of Liverpool and Chair of the Hillsborough Independent Panel. We're delighted that you're with us, Bishop James, and we look forward to what you have to say and to your answering of questions afterwards. Thank you very much.
Chairman of the Council, Vice-Chancellor, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour to be here this evening, and as we've been reminded, in this very special week in our common life. And I'm impressed by so many people turning up. I have done a number of broadcasts, and actually I've even written some books. One book I wrote was called Why Do People Suffer? And when the proofs returned from the publishers, they'd left off the question mark. So the title of the book ran, Why Do People Suffer, James Jones? And This is, in fact, what the Diocese of Liverpool has been thinking for the last 15 years, and what you might, of course, think tonight. But, ladies and gentlemen, I accept only a few invitations to speak about the work of the Hillsborough Independent Panel. I choose the occasions thoughtfully, and I'm here today because this university played an important role in the Hillsborough narrative through the work that was pioneered by Professor Phil Scraton, who has now moved on from this university to Queen's University Belfast. Phil was a member of the Hillsborough Independent Panel, and his knowledge and research expertise were central to the panel's work. But I'm here also because the invitation has come through the chaplaincy, and it's an invitation to give my own perspective, which inevitably is bound up with me being a priest and the Bishop of Liverpool. The 20th anniversary was the turning point for the families and the survivors. If you had rehearsed the crowd of over 30,000 people that day, they could not have been in greater unison in their chanting for justice for the 96. The size of the crowd and the volume of the chant demonstrated to all that the wound of Hillsborough was open and sore, and that it was infected with what the families knew to be lies, and that wound was therefore deprived of the ointment of truth, so that wound simply could not heal. For me, as a priest and a pastor of the city, the words of faith that came through so strongly on that day to me were words to be found in the Gospels, the narrative of the life of Jesus Christ, who talked so openly about the need to heal the brokenhearted. Andy Burnham went from the stadium that day, and after much negotiation with politicians and officials, was responsible for the Home Secretary, Alan Johnson, setting up the Hillsborough Independent Panel. Our terms of reference were to oversee the maximum possible disclosure of the documents, to write a report that added to public understanding of the tragedy and its aftermath, and to make recommendations on the establishing of a national archive. The panel was also required to liaise with the families in this task. There was such a history of distrust of public authorities that one of the early issues was how would the panel secure the confidence of the families in the task that they had been given. We decided that we would meet the families on the very first day that the panel members met each other. This proved formative. Indeed, the encounter with the three family groups provided the glue that bound the panel together throughout its work. We listened carefully to all the questions that were raised, which then formed a map on which we worked. The panel and the Secretariat met regularly with representatives of the various groups, and during these meetings, I was often told that the panel was the family's last hope. Movingly, we were also told that this was the first time that they felt that they were being taken seriously and being listened to. It is one of the major aspects of the panel's work that we were able to engage with the families so constructively. As a panel, we were interrogating documents and not people. This meant that the process was not encumbered in the way that inquiries are with the necessary involvement of lawyers. The problem with inquiries is that they often rebuff, or at least keep at a distance, the very people most affected by the tragedy. The panel was able to draw them into the process. The chant on the terraces gave voice to the basic instinct of the families and survivors, which was to seek justice for the 96. This gave me and my colleagues cause to reflect upon the meaning of justice. I believe it is simply to give someone their due. It is, as I quoted from a 4th century Christian philosopher in the foreword to the panel's report, justice is to give to others through humanity what we give to our family through affection. A person, it seems to me, has a right to know how and why their loved one died. I remember making this very point to a cabinet minister after the general election. The incoming government was not bound by the decision of the previous government, so the case had to be made all over again to the 4 sponsoring departments that the work of the panel should continue. When in one conversation I was rightly pressed to make the case, I heard myself saying to a cabinet minister, "If 20 years on, you still did not know how or why your child had been killed, I think you too would still want to know the answer to those questions." To the cabinet minister's credit, the point was taken. I would like here to pay tribute, as the families have already done on Monday, to Theresa May, the Home Secretary, who, following in the footsteps of Alan Johnson, has given wholehearted support to the panel's work throughout its process. If I began the work thinking that the justification for me as a bishop spending so much time was the hope of healing the broken-hearted, then by the end of the panel's work, I was under no illusion that what was at stake was the delivery of justice to those that had been denied it. Every day for 3 months before the disclosure of the material and the publication of the panel's report, in my daily prayers, I read the parable of the unjust judge which Jesus told in Luke's Gospel, chapter 18. I would like to read it to you now. The theme of this allegory seemed to have so much resonance with the Hillsborough narrative. Quote, "Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, 'In a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, "Grant me justice against my opponent." For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, "Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming." And the Lord said, Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith in the God of justice on earth? On the panel, we had several discussions about where we should convene the meeting to disclose the documents and publish the report. Our terms of reference made it clear that it was the families themselves who must first hear the outcome of our work. In the end, we all agreed that the Anglican Cathedral provided the best place. It offered the families and the survivors security and a safe place to hear what we knew by then would be traumatic material. It allowed them protection from the media, especially as they absorbed difficult information. It allowed them to regain their composure before being exposed to the world's media. And it provided a suitable place in which they could remember with reverence their 96 loved ones. Chairing the proceedings that day felt to me like taking the funeral of someone you love when you have to tighten the valve on your own emotions. As the media reported, 3 people fainted when Bill Kirkup, the medical director, revealed the findings of the post-mortems. After the initial presentation, which lasted an hour and a half, 2 men came to the podium to take the microphone. They came to apologize for not having trusted the panel. This before the Prime Minister had come to the dispatch box in the House of Commons to apologise on behalf of the government and the nation for the double injustice that the families and survivors had had to endure. At the end of the day, as I bade farewell to the families, commending them for their patience and endurance, I told them that I would go to the chapter house, which the Dean had turned into a chapel for the 96. I turned around and I walked the length of the cathedral. For the next hour, as I knelt in my stall, so many of the 250 who had gathered that day seemed to follow me into the chapel to remember the 96 and to pray. My prayer was that truth and justice would prevail in God's world. I think it was the only time I mentioned God in the whole 3 years. Throughout the last 24 years, and indeed on that day, the 12th of September 2012, the families conducted themselves with exemplary dignity. The reaction of the city has been one of extraordinary solidarity, yet it was a bitter-sweet vindication. Here at last was the proof that the families had not campaigned in vain. Yet with this disclosure came not only a reliving of the tragedy, but new doubts and grief. What if? This evening I am very willing to take a few questions or to listen to observations. But clearly what I am not able to do is to comment on the substance of the report. This now has been given to the Independent Police Complaints Commission, to the Department of Public Prosecutions, and to the newly appointed coroner, Lord Justice Goldring, whom I have met and talked with. The panel has interrogated the documents and produced a report that does indeed add to public understanding of the tragedy and its aftermath. The different judicial processes now set in train must interrogate those who are implicated by these documents. In order for justice to be done, these processes need to proceed justly. The necessary involvement now of lawyers representing the different parties will inevitably have an impact on the timescale. My hope with the families is that these judicial procedures will be expedited as efficiently and as speedily as possible. The next anniversary of Hillsborough will mark a quarter of a century. It has been a long night of dark and sorrow, but there are signs of a new day dawning for the families and the survivors. In the end, God alone is judge and knows the secrets of our hearts. But standing this side of eternity, I believe that serving as chair of the panel may prove to be the most important aspect of my ministry as Bishop of Liverpool. I could not have done it without the excellence of my colleagues in both the panel and the secretariat, nor could I have done it without the support of my colleagues in the Diocese of Liverpool. I certainly could not have done it without my wife Sarah and my own family. And in the end, it is that family love that lies at the heart of the Hillsborough narrative, which is why the families, out of their own love for the 96, can do no other than honour their memory with both truth and justice. That is their due and ours too. Thank you very much. We do now have an opportunity for questions. There are 3 microphones available to us. So if you put your hand up if you've got something to say, and then wait for the microphone to reach you, I'll just call out people as I see your hand raised. And it doesn't have to be a question. It can be an observation. And you are part of this narrative as well as I am. Barry.
You've been involved with. Thank you. The support that you've given the families and the publication of the said report is absolutely first class. Nobody would say anything else other than that. You've been everything that we've not had for 24 years. When I first met you, and you referred to 2 people before, I was one of the 2 people that you're referring to. It wasn't a question of me being wrong and you being right. It was a question that so many doors had been slammed in the family's faces on so many occasions that the next person you meet, and in my case it happened to be yourself, James, do we trust you? And you remember quite vividly when I said, I've no desire to insult you or offend you, but why should we trust you any more than anybody else? On the publication of that report to all the families at the Anglican Cathedral, I came up to say one thing. That was thank you. And I stand by that. Thank you.
And it was, Barry, for all of my colleagues on the panel and in the secretariat, deeply moving when you and the other person came to the microphone, because we felt, and I personally, that before anybody had apologized to you for not being trustworthy in the past, you had expressed that confidence in us and appreciation. And I think it was moving for us because, again, that demonstrated the dignity and the grace, if I can use that word, that we as a panel found in the families. We also obviously found anger and frustration, but marbled through everybody's heart was this extraordinary dignity and grace, and that's what came out when you, because none of us knew what you were going to say at that particular moment, and that's why it made such a big impact upon me and my colleagues. Thank you. Yes, please. The microphone's coming to you.
Obviously, this is needed for your personal reflection. How has this process affected you personally as a person?
There are different dimensions to answering that question, and I can just, I think, give you one now. I feel I could write a book to do it justice, your question. Thank you. Well, perhaps I might write it then. I'll give you a slice of the royalties. It's not a secret, because when you're in public life, personal details come into the public domain. In the middle of the process, I was diagnosed with a heart problem, which required me having a triple heart bypass. And when I was doing the tread test, and the consultant came down and stopped the tread test, and actually I thought I was doing rather well on the tread test, but he said no. And I said to the nurse, and then to the consultant, would I still be able to do Hillsborough? That was my first thought. And I was then told that I had to have an angiogram, and then within a few days had the surgery. And anybody who's had surgery knows that it's in the middle of the night when you can't get to sleep. I mean, you take as many pills as you're allowed to take and hope that they'll do the trick, and you can't get to sleep. And in those early hours, all sorts of thoughts and doubts stalk your soul, and I would pray, asking God to make me better so that I could complete the task. But, and this takes us into a very profound philosophical and theological area, I was conscious as I prayed, who was I to ask God to help me when 96 people had died and those who loved them would be entitled to ask, where was God for them in that moment? So it's a difficult one to answer, but the truthful one is that I've had a sense of calling, without being, I hope, pietistic and superficial, a sense of calling to serve in this way, because by that time I had met with the families on many occasions, and they had made a deep impression upon me. And I realized the importance of the work. And not just for them, and I think Margaret would support this. The Hillsborough narrative and the report has been a watershed moment in the life of the nation. Not just about Liverpool and Merseyside and Liverpool Football Club and fans. I mean, I have been stopped in the House of Lords, where, as a bishop, I sit, and been told by colleagues there of the national significance of what has been achieved. So the answer to your question is that it has affected me personally. It does continue to affect me. And I think, as all the families and survivors will say, that as time goes by, so those reflections change a bit like a kaleidoscope, like looking through a kaleidoscope. It's the same love, it's the same tragedy, but it's refracted through different crystals. Please.
Good evening. I think that sometimes you are tested in your life. Do you feel that this is one of the hardest tests that you've had to pass? Also in your religious faith and the faith in the people that you you've supported over the last 24 years?
I certainly identify with the word test, but I think I would have to say that any test that I have experienced pales into insignificance with the testing that the families and the survivors have had to endure, because they've not only had to endure their loss, they've had to endure with people believing a lie about their loss. And I don't think any of us can fully appreciate the depth of despair that must drive you to, when in your grief you find that others are telling lies about those for whom you are grieving. And that must be one of the greatest tests that any human being has to endure. And I think that really puts into proportion my own difficulties. Please. Microphone's just coming.
In this troubled world that we live in, it's been absolutely wonderful to see what family love, faith, prayer, solidarity of people saying, no, we're not going to let this happen. And it's been wonderful to see, and I congratulate the way that you've worked with all the families and all the rest. And it's wonderful to see that the church did not cross the road. It stayed on the right side of the road and said, we are family together and our faith will bind us together. And you've achieved that, Bishop James. And we can only thank you from the bottom of our hearts that we can say to our grandchildren, there is a better life, and that life is based on faith and people helping, considering, being tolerant of other people with whatever life may take them. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And with that generous acknowledgement, I want to underline what I said in my prepared text, is that none of this could have happened without the excellence, and I use that word deliberately, without the excellence of the panel and the secretariat. On the panel, we had people who were experts in their field and in different fields. And everybody played to their own strength. So whenever an issue arose on the panel, it was like holding it up to the light and different people around the room seeing different facets of the issue and throwing onto that facet the light of their own expertise. And no meeting ever ended in acrimony. Sometimes there was tension, understandably, but there was, especially having had this glue of meeting with the families on the first day, we were sort of bound together in this common purpose. And we were able to acknowledge each other's expertise. It was so free of competitiveness on the panel. I mean, in my life, my professional life, chaired a number of bodies, and sometimes you get people who are sort of vying for position. This was such, it sounds a cliche, I know, but it was such a privileged chair, because we had there the country's leading experts all working together collaboratively, and we were then served by a panel of civil servants. And I know the civil service comes in for a lot of knocks. But my experience, having chaired the Hillsborough Independent Panel and the Independent Panel on Forestry, is that we have some of the finest civil servants in the world. And their expertise on the Hillsborough Panel was extraordinary. And Ken Sutton, who I would like to single out, who headed up the Secretariat, he was responsible for bringing both the Secretariat, assembling the Secretariat, and assembling the panel. And he clearly knew what was needed so that there was no overlap on the panel. Everybody had their own expertise. And it was that leadership that I believe contributed so significantly to the success of the panel's work. We had just the right people to do the task. And I have to say, I've mentioned it already, the engagement with the families was so important because nobody knew what it was that we were going to unearth. And we started with a particular timescale given by the Home Secretary. And as certain material became available to us, we then realized that that was going to send us in new directions that we hadn't previously thought of and would take more time. And given, as Barry says, the sort of history of distrust in authority, when we then came back and said, oh no, it's going to take us longer, you could imagine what people would think. Oh yes, yet another stalling mechanism, yet another diversion. And at that point, we were deeply dependent upon the different support groups, understanding and trusting us in that moment. Because as a public body, if they had lost trust in us at that moment, that would have got into the media and that would have affected the progress of the panel's work. But crucially, they told us, and I mean Margaret and Barry here too, and others to verify this, they said, we want the job done properly. If it takes a bit more time, we've waited 23 years, we want the job done properly. But at that point, it did call into question whether the panel was trustworthy. But having built up that relationship, then I think it was on that relationship that the families then had to make their judgment as to whether or not they could trust us at that point. So the engagement with the families was very important, and bearing in mind that the experience of the families through the different judicial processes, and I don't think it's breaking any confidence now if I say to you that I have made this clear to the coroner, Lord Justice Goldring, that the families must be treated differently from the way they have been treated previously. Because that is a part of justice. Human dignity is a part of justice. And therefore, the families must be respected throughout the process. And that's what we endeavoured to do ourselves as a panel. So you kindly acknowledge what the panel has done. The panel could not have done it without the full cooperation and trust of the families and survivors. Please, Margaret.
Bishop, you were talking there then about trust, and you had to have the trust from all the families. And I can tell you from day one, I always had that trust. From the minute I met you and you spoke to me, my trust was there with the HIP. Because I'd met quite on numerous occasions with Alan Johnson and, as you know, Theresa May. And everything we put forward to them, she'd already told us that you'd put it forward on our behalf as well. So when you say about families had to earn trust, I mean, I can particularly say a time, going back when the panel was working on the documentation, we had a bit of a job, because the reason for that being some people said they trusted the media, I won't say which side, more than the independent panel. We ended up having to answer that and say, no, the Hillsborough Family Support Group trust the independent panel. Our trust was proven. We were right for all the way along. I know the other person who went up on the stage and said, but that was because of his private concerns as well. And I can only say to you, Bishop, to you now, and honestly say this: you have restored the faith that I'd lost, and the HIP restored faith that I'd lost in human beings. But then on saying that, I always had faith in our fans and our supporters. For all them years, not one of them let us down. For 24 years, they were there supporting the families every step of the way. So I've got to say, and I'd like this on record to you, Bishop, that I thank our fans and our supporters for everything they have done for us, because without them, we would have never have got to the truth of Hillsborough. Them coming home and doing what they done on that terrible day, they helped to save so many lives. And without their statements and their recollections, none of us here today would have got the truth. So I'm thanking all of them as well, Bishop, as well as you, for what you've done for all of us, and the HIP and the Secretariat, and indeed, as you mentioned before, Theresa May as well, for carrying it on with us. So thank you, Bishop.
And Margaret, thank you. Margaret, thank you very much for drawing out that context so valuably. Standing here in a university and a research institution, I do think what you've touched upon is what sustains people when they are denied justice. And you've begun to put your finger on it. And, if people do ever wish to do research, I think that would be a very valuable area to explore. What will sustain people in future when there are other miscarriages of justice? And I have to say that one of the consequences of the panel's work for me is that I am now written to on a regular basis from all over the country, people asking me if I will help them in the pursuit of justice, which they feel they've been denied. And thank you very much, Margaret, for that contribution. Is there another observation?
Hi, yes, please. I was privileged to be in the cathedral on the day the panel, was reported. And you've spoken, obviously, very, giving credit to the expertise in the panel and the different, disciplines they were, or different areas, and that's how, the report delivered, such a fantastic result, and makes us all feel a lot lighter, I'm sure. I just wanted to talk about you as a man. One of the things I didn't get a chance to do on the day was personally to shake your hand and say thanks. And it was with such emotion on the day. I just noticed, it was an observation of you, of watching you, was that you were so calm and reassuring. I'm not a member of the Church of England, but I do remember being in school and being taught, through Christian education, what the definition of about Jesus, and obviously as a representative, the priests are. And I said something really corny when I left a message for you at the Anglican with some assistant or whoever it is at yours. I said, it sounds like corny this, and I don't care who skits us for it, but you were the definition of I just felt like you were the shepherd. Everyone was really struggling that day, even though we'd been delivered with what we really wanted for so long. But you were so compassionate and caring and kind, and I just wanted to thank you personally. And I don't think you've had enough credit, really. I know everyone's made up and everyone talks about the panel, but as a man, you were the definition of what the priest should be. And I'd just like to thank you from the bottom of my heart, really. That's it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
in this excellent work that you've done, you've gone way beyond the pulpit and the vestry into the lives of ordinary people in the ordinary world. We don't see church leaders doing this that often. If it's a good idea that you should have been involved, as you were, and I think it was a splendid idea, should not other church leaders be urged to involve themselves more in the myriad of problems that affect so many people in our country today?
That gives me an opportunity, that question, to explain the place of the Church of England in the life of the nation. There is not an inch or a centimetre of England that is not covered by a parish. And our understanding of the role of the Church of England is that the priest and the congregation, but especially the vicar, is not just the shepherd of the sheep who come to church on a Sunday, but is shepherd of everybody who lives within that parish boundary. So that if you ring up a vicar and say, my dad's had a heart attack, he's in hospital, would you go and visit him? The vicar does not say, well, do you come to church on Sunday? He simply says, where do you live? And if you live within the vicar's boundary, within the parish boundary, the vicar has a responsibility to go and to care. And you do see that across England with vicars who care for the whole parish, although I have to say there are some churches which are introspective and don't live that out as much as they should. But by extension, when you come to a bishop and say to a bishop, will you help in doing whatever? The bishop's question is not, does this belong to me promoting the church, but is this about caring for the people who live within the boundary, within the field of which I am the shepherd? Such a good image that you've used. And so when I was asked to do this, I took advice from my colleagues, from my close colleagues, and they spoke with me frankly about it. I spoke with those colleagues who were going to have to take on responsibilities that I would need to shed in order to make time for it. I talked with the Archbishop of Canterbury about whether or not this was the right thing for me to do. He was absolutely clear, Rowan Williams, that this was the right thing for me to do. And it was that understanding that made me think, no, this is the proper work of the Bishop of Liverpool if he's asked to do this. And I was in fact speaking to my colleagues, the other bishops in the Church of England last week, about Hillsborough and trying to encourage them to do exactly what you have said. And one of the problems facing the Church of England at the moment is that it has got mired in internal politics about women bishops and gay relationships, and does not seem to be able to get itself out of that mire. And in fact, the world, it seems to me, looks upon the Church of England when it's doing that, thinking what an unhealthy attitude to women it has, women in leadership, and what a damaging attitude they have towards people who are gay. Now, whatever view you take theologically or ethically, it worries me that we have got trapped in that cul-de-sac. And I hope very much that my colleagues will see that an invitation to chair a panel on the future of forestry, an invitation to chair the independent panel on Hillsborough, is the proper work of a church leader. Of course, you will be aware that once a bishop does get involved in areas beyond the walls of the church, if people don't like what they then hear, they then resort to, oh, well, bishops should just, concentrate on God and leave the rest of the world to us. But from a theological point of view, this is my answer. On what grounds can you withdraw from the sovereignty of God any aspect of his creation? Jesus once said this. He said, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them falls to the ground without God the Father as they fall to the ground." Giving us this extraordinary Christian insight that when people die and suffer, it's not God inhabiting some trouble-free paradise, watching like some detached spectator from the terraces of heaven. It is God alongside us, suffering with us. And therefore, when a bishop is asked, or a priest is asked, to be involved in the world rather than in the church, I believe he's following exactly in the footsteps of Jesus and his teaching. That just as God is there beyond the walls of the church, alongside the least, the last, and the lost, so those people who aspire to be shepherds need to be with the sheep as well. That has brought us really now to the end of our time of questions. I think there's probably just one last one, and if that can be very brief, just the microphone here. And then after we've had this question, I'm going to ask that we stand in silence and remember the 96 before we leave.
I will be brief, but all of the 15 years you have been bishop in Liverpool, my wife and I have been working tourist guides, and we've been in and out of both the city's cathedrals, telling them what you would expect us to say about the cathedrals, but we would also be saying what an asset they have been to the role of the city. We've done all sorts of guiding activities, but when the opportunity has arisen, and particularly in the years following the Capital of Culture year, we have found more and more visitors coming to Liverpool and staying in Liverpool. And when we have had an opportunity to influence the itinerary, I have taken them to the Hillsborough Memorial. And we've been parked outside the cathedral and have just had a few brief moments to reflect. And people from very different parts of the country, but long distances, who've never ever been to the city before, have begun to listen. And we've illustrated how the exit gate was opened and led to the complications. And people were listening. And what we have heard in the release of the report in the last few months has totally vindicated what we have been trying to say and do. And I'm thinking back now to the many hundreds of people we've seen and just identifying with them. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very good conclusion to bring us to. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you now to stand in memory of the 96. May they rest in peace and in truth and justice and in love. Amen. Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, for those who don't know me, I'm John Cater, and I have the privilege of being both the Vice-Chancellor of this university and tonight the person who's been asked to give the vote of thanks. Bishop James spoke earlier about the important role of universities in terms of research, of acquiring and assessing evidence, and helping that evidence to produce the truth. And Edgehill University is proud that it played a small part in the Hillsborough investigation. Phil Scraton was a colleague of mine for more than 20 years, who worked throughout that period on the Hillsborough disaster, who wrote a book, Hillsborough the Truth, which had I think very important ramifications. And I can tell one small story about Phil, and this is about 12, maybe 15 years ago, when he was taken into hospital, rushed into hospital for some internal investigation. And the following day, I turned up at the hospital with a fairly light read novel, I think it was a Nick Hornby book, and Phil was sitting up in bed, and alongside him was a pile of papers which must have been at least a foot high. And I said to Phil, "What on earth are you doing?" He said, well, John, I'm not staying in here for long because there's work to do. And I think I know what that work was. I'm also grateful, actually, to some current colleagues as well. Carl Hunter, Peter Hooton, and people associated with the farm, have actually, I think, also helped to keep, the campaign in the public eye. And we're delighted, actually, this evening that we are able to invite you across, for drinks, and there's actually a photographic exhibition of the Justice Tonight tour, which took place last year. So I'm grateful, obviously, to my colleagues there, but I'm also grateful, actually, to Chris and to the Multi-Faith Chaplaincy, who orchestrated this evening, and also, actually, to my team of very committed, very hard-working staff, Liverpool fans, almost all of them, who have actually made this evening happen. None of us can forget where we were on that fateful day. I was actually driving on the M6 with the radio on, listening, expecting to listen to football matches on the way to see my mother. Some people perhaps didn't have that opportunity. My greatest thanks tonight are to all of you, to the audience, for joining us and for sharing your thoughts, your views and your emotions. And of course, my very grateful thanks to the Right Reverend James Jones, the Bishop of Liverpool, not only for this evening, but especially for his enormous contribution in chairing the independent panel and editing a report which has convinced every reader of the rightful interpretation of those events 24 years ago. Others have said, this is not the end. It's not even the beginning of the end. But I see this actually as a new beginning with a prospect of a rightful and just end. Thank you, Bishop James, and all of you for being with us and for sharing your thoughts this evening. Thank you.